Good evening, Dean.
Good evening, Uella. How are you doing?
I'm great, Dean. Dean, the bond auction by the Bank of Zambia comes up monthly, and today we had one. Could you tell us how it went in terms of subscription and what it means for the government of the Republic of Zambia?
Well, today's subscription rate wasn't too great. So subscription rate came in at around 30%. If you compare that to the previous two auctions, the last auction in July, the subscription rate was around 73%. And then before that, it was 86%. So the question is obviously why we had a significant drop in subscription. If you look at the MPC, obviously with that cut, a lot of people may have possibly thought that we were going to see the bond yields coming lower. But because of the fact that you had the government trying to dismantle some of those arrears, remember the arrears figure was around 26.2 billion at the end of December. So the government was trying to dismantle some arrears. So what they did is that they issued some bonds to some corporates, and some of these corporates were actually some oil marketing companies, but they issued some bonds to some of these corporates. And then these corporates, because they needed the kwacha either to pay down kwacha facilities or to pay down dollar facilities, or to even use the kwacha to buy dollars, what you saw is that you saw some of these corporates selling those bonds. You had an oversupply of bonds on the secondary market. You had increased bond trading, but those bonds, 2 to 5 year bonds, they were trading above the primary market. But because of that oversupply of bonds that we had, based on that dismantling of arrears, that's why you had that low subscription rate coming into this auction. So it was only 30% bidding interest, and it was predominantly skewed to small number of offshore players, but largely the bidding interest came from local players. But the government, out of the 1.5 billion kwacha they were looking to raise, they only managed to raise 446 million kwacha.
Yeah, Dean, with that amount of money raised, I want us to discuss during the MPC meeting on Wednesday. The governor did say that China was thinking of cancelling or at least delaying interest payments on government loans. The governor was saying that is actually very good and hoping that even the Paris Club does the same. Does that just cushion with the 400 million plus raised? Do those put together at least cushion the government in the coming months?
I think it would be significant if we could get some of those debt moratoriums from the Chinese lenders. A lot of those Chinese loans that we do have are classified as commercial loans. So it would be very nice to get some debt moratoriums there. If you look at the budget financing gap, it's around 26.9 billion kwacha. So it's very important for us. I think also what's going to be important is an emergency IMF deal. And for that, what's going to be very key is fiscal consolidation, particularly fiscal consolidation in that 2021 national budget. That budget reading is going to be on the 25th of September. So we'd be hoping to see some signs of fiscal consolidation. And with regards to interest rates moving lower, the reason why that emergency IMF assistance is very important is because you've already seen a preference for local investors to shift their preference from the longer end to the shorter end. So you've seen less local bidding interest in the bond space. And local banks and are more or less predominantly buying 3-month to 12-month T-bills. So central bank has done their part with regards to injecting liquidity, expanding their balance sheet, also with regards to that targeted medium-term refinancing facility, where they've already disbursed around 1.1 to 1.5 billion. So there's still another 3.5 billion to come into the market, which is going to boost liquidity. But that liquidity, you're only really seeing that effect playing a part with regards to the shorter end of the curve. So the 3-month to the 12-month T-bills, those interest rates are coming lower because you're seeing increased liquidity and an increased bidding interest from local players. In the longer end, because the preference has shifted for local players to the shorter end, you'll need to see a lot more offshore interest in the longer end for those 2 to 15-year bonds to start coming lower. And for that to happen, you need to see that sentiment pendulum completely shifting into positive territory. And an emergency IMF assistance is going to be very, very key to unlocking that. So just reiterating the importance of that budget reading on the 25th of September.
Yeah, Dean, the targeted medium-term refinancing facility, the governor did say that they had approved 5 billion kwacha worth of loans, but only, like you said, 1.5 has been disbursed. Why the slow disbursement?
I'm not sure with regards to the slow disbursement. It could be with regards to the banks finalizing their process with regards to on lending to the client side of things. But I think what's more important is to note that with liquidity at 3.5 billion, this market is going to see another injection of liquidity of 3.5 billion. And then if you also take into account the decision at the Monetary Policy Committee when they sat, right? So they reduced the monetary policy rate by 125%. 125 basis points. That means that targeted medium-term refinancing facility is now available at 9%, which is significantly lower than where it was available at the beginning of the year when they started the stimulus, which was at 12.5%. So what we do anticipate is you're likely going to see even more increased bidding interest and possibly even more acceptance. So this market is going to potentially see more than 3.5 billion kwacha in terms of liquidity. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that the central bank is still injecting liquidity through the 3-month OMO. They've been injecting liquidity there, and they're likely to do so even this Monday. So continues to speak to the fact that we'll continue seeing the shorter end of the curve coming lower. Longer end, I've mentioned, still need to continue seeing significant offshore bidding interest. But in terms of the curve, you're going to continue seeing a widening of the difference between where the 3-month to the 12-month T-bill rates are and the difference between where the 2 to the 5-year bond yields are.
Right, Dean, the local currency, our Zambian kwacha, has depreciated by almost 4% this week, starting the week at about 18.7 to $1, and now, as of yesterday, closed just shy of 19. I think today is closed at 19.2. Could you take us through how the markets have performed today and give us a rundown of the performance for the week?
Well, today we opened at around 9.1. We closed at around 9.225. Over the course of the week, as you mentioned, we opened at around 18.705 and we've closed at 19.225. So against the dollar, the kwacha is 2.8% weaker. If you look at the rand, opened the week at around 1.062, currently at 1.124, and that's around 5.8% weaker. So the kwacha has been weak this week, and it's been a function of a confluence of factors, really. So the main one to speak about is obviously the dollarization of mining taxes. That has significantly reduced the FX supply coming in from the mining sector into the market. So that's the key. We've also had some expansion of the central bank balance sheet, which has been supportive of an increase in importation, and it's likely that we're going to see demand coming through and importation picking up towards the rest of the year. But then you also have now two significant other factors. I mentioned the fact that the government did use bonds to dismantle some of the arrears to some of the corporates, and some of these corporates were oil marketing companies. So what we did see was an increase in energy dollar demand, or an increase in dollar demand from energy corporates. So that dollar demand may cool going forward, but you also have the problem that the agricultural dollar demand for the farmer input support program has begun about 2 months before it was supposed to begin. So usually you have, for this farmer input support program where the government budgets to support the agricultural industry with regards to importation of fertilizer. So with the first program, you've got around, for the first program, we need to import fertilizer so as to support our planting season, which begins around November to January, which is in line with when we have increased precipitation in the country. So if you look at that farmer input support program, usually that dollar demand for importation of fertilizer begins at the end of September to the beginning of October. But now we've already started seeing some of this agricultural dollar demand for fertilizer beginning in August. So you've got increased agricultural dollar demand, increased energy dollar demand, and then on the other side, you've got reduced FX mining supply, and that's the reason why you're seeing the kwacha coming under pressure.
Yeah.
Going forward,
sorry, Dean. Historically, from what you've mentioned, from about mid-month to end of the month, the trend for the local currency is such that it gains value, mainly because of large corporates converting their dollar into kwacha to fulfill monthly tax obligations. Does the coming week give us an opportunity to the kwacha to pick up some of these losses this week?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very good. One of the things that, with regards to the dollarization of mining taxes, at least that only covered the tax conversions in the middle of the month. So you're still seeing the same quantums that we used to see from the mining industry with regards to those salary and end-month conversions, for even for supplier payments. So it's going to be very supportive of the kwacha next week. Also, we've seen the central bank trying to sell some dollars to try and alleviate some of this pressure that we're seeing with regards to the dollar demand overwhelming the dollar supply that we have in the market. So in terms of a pullback, looking for a pullback to around 18.5 to 18.7 next week. Unfortunately, though, the trajectory, at least in the medium to the long term, does look like Kwacha may potentially continue to be weaker based on the fact that you've seen this increased agricultural dollar demand that's expected to be in the market till the end of December.
Right. Let's look at the global scenario right now. Could you give us a rundown of how the global markets have performed as they start closing for the weekend, coming from the Far East going on to the Americas?
Yeah, sure. I'll begin with economic data today. If you look at the economic data out of the US, if you look at the PMI, it's better than expected. If you look at existing home sales, those were actually the highest recorded since December 2006. So economic data of the US looking positive. In the UK as well, you had better than expected PMI data. So also looking good. However, if you look at Germany and if you look at the Eurozone, you've got PMI data coming in worse than expected. So in the US, it's looking sort of like a V shape. And then in Europe, it's sort of like looking like the beginning of a W-shaped recovery. And I think that's very important because if you look at stock markets this week, mostly in negative territory, apart from S&P and the Nasdaq, which was over 2.5% higher, mostly on the back of those performance of the large tech stocks, the likes of Facebook and Alphabet. But if you look at the rest of equity markets across the globe, mostly lower because of concerns emanating from those Fed minutes that you mentioned. So if you look at the Fed minutes, the Fed is increasingly concerned about the second half of the year. And I think it's a very fair point because if you look at the second half of the year, it does look like we're in the absence of a vaccine, it does look like we're going to continue seeing consumer demand challenges. It does look like we're going to seeing investment demand challenges, investment spending challenges. It does look like unemployment could potentially be a problem. And also, I think you're probably going to see a rise in corporate bankruptcies and credit impairments. So I think for me, that W-shaped recovery that you're seeing out of that PMI data in Europe, I think the beginning of that W-shaped recovery, I think that's what's going to pan out for the rest of the global economy.
Dean, thank you so much for coming through. Do have a great weekend.
Thank you, Wala.
All right.